Good day and welcome to the Matric History Revision. Today we'll be looking at the civil society protests in South Africa with special focus on the Black consciousness movement in the 1970s. So the way I'll be doing this, I'll look at the skills you need to know in history, and then we will look at the specific exam questions that you should expect to get at the end of the year. In terms of the skills, you need to make sure that you know how to analyze sources. So you'll find that in your exam, there will be written and visual sources. So you get text, where it could be a speech or an address, a president address, and then visual, where it could be a photograph or a cartoon. Then the next thing you should know is how to detect bias. So you should know whether the source supports what was going on in the country at the time or it is against it. And then the next skill will be assessing the usefulness of the source. So you'll be looking at whether the source can be useful to historians who are studying that particular period. And then you need to give reasons why you say a source can be useful or it can be useless. In terms of that, you will be looking at the content, the things that the source has left out, or the information that you feel will be useful in understanding the period. So after assessing the usefulness of the source, you need to ask yourself whether the source is reliable or not. That is another very important skill in history. Now, usually people confuse the two. Usefulness means, can the source be used to understand the period? So you can find that a source can be useful but not reliable, because reliability means, can the source be trusted to understand the period? So that is another very important skill in history. And then once you've done that, you look at the value of the source. Now, the value ties in with the usefulness and reliability. So there you'll be looking at who made the source, when the source was made. So if it's a primary source, is it more useful than a secondary source? You'll be looking at why the person made the source. So that would be value. And then the next thing would be a limitation. Limitation is the direct opposite of value. That is where you look at the things that limit the source. So those are the things that will determine the usefulness or the reliability of the source. So under limitation, you'll be looking at things like the information that is left out. So you will say, for example, this source was made by a communist who was involved in the event, therefore he didn't reveal everything about the event. That would be the limitation. Or another thing that is part of limitation is the bias that I spoke about earlier on, that you need to detect bias. So you could say that just because this source is written by a communist, he is only saying good things about communism. He is not looking at the negative things. And in terms of apartheid South Africa, you'll be looking at whether this source was written by a government official or it was written by somebody who was in the struggle. Because what will happen is somebody who worked for the government is not likely to criticize the government, whereas somebody who was in the struggle, let's say a member of the Black consciousness movement or the ANC, will then criticize the government, because that is what the struggle was about. And then the next skill that is very important in history is understanding the origin of the source. Now, the origin of the source will help you understand all the previous skills I've spoken about, like usefulness, reliability, bias, and all that. So that refers to when the source was written, where it comes from. So you'll be looking at the caption. The caption at the top of the source gives you that information, where the source is from. I'm going to give you an example of that. Okay, I'm going to give you an example that shows the origin of the source. Okay, if you look at the examination paper from 2012, you see the source booklet has source 1. And source 1 has got a caption that describes the source. Now it says this extract focuses on the influence that the philosophy of black consciousness had on the Soweto Uprising of 1976. Now, this entire information tells you what this source is about. And then it goes on to say that it was written in 1976. Now that is the origin of the source. You know that the Soweto Uprising took place in 1976, but the source was written in 1978, 2 years after the event. So that type of information should help you answer the questions later on. And who wrote this source? It was written by John Kane Berman, who was a member of the SRC at the University of the Witwatersrand. He was a member of the SRC. So already that should be ringing bells. It should be telling you that this is a person who was a student, because the SRC is the Student Representative Council. He was a student writing about the student uprising of 1976. So even before you read the source, you already know what type of information the source is going to contain. That might not always be the case, but that gives you an idea of the kind of source you'll be dealing with. Okay, let's go back to the skills. So in terms of the exam structure, your exam paper, you'll be expected to do the following. Comprehension. The first questions that you will get in the exam will be the questions that require you to understand the source. So you just read the source and you prove that you've understood what the source is about. In that case, you are not bringing your own knowledge, you are not bringing extra information, you just show that you understand what is in front of you. That is what comprehension is about. And then the next thing will be extraction. That is where you will be proving again that you have comprehended the source and you are able to take out relevant information from the source to answer that specific question. That is what extraction means. And then we move on to the higher order thinking skills. Then you will be expected to interpret the source. Now, when you interpret the source, that is where your own knowledge comes in as well. And that caption I showed you earlier on does help you interpret the source. So you will say, this source is about the Soweto Uprising and it's looking at it in a negative or a positive way, and you should be able to pick out words from the source that help you interpret the source. And then the next skill is analysis. So that is where you break down the source. What exactly is this source about? This source is looking at the aims of black consciousness, it is looking at the actual Soweto Uprising, and it is looking at the results of the Soweto Uprising, for example. And then the next skill that you'll be expected to practice in the exam will be application. That is where you now use your own knowledge to apply to the source information. So you sort of marry the two. You bring your own knowledge to show that you've comprehended the source, to show that you can extract information and you have interpreted it correctly. You now need to apply your own information. So that is where you can give your views and extra information from what you've learned in class. And then the last thing you'll be expected to do is you will get views from different perspectives. So let's say, for example, you will have a source that is written by a member of the Black Consciousness Movement or Steve Biko himself, and then you have another source that is written by a government official. Now you'll be expected to compare and contrast those sources. So when you're comparing the sources, that's when you'll be looking for similarities. So you'll be looking for things that are the same between the two sources. Are they both criticizing the government? Are they both praising the Black consciousness movement? Something similar. And then when you're contrasting the sources, that is where you'll be looking for differences between the sources. So for example, you can say this source left out information that is contained in the previous source. This one has obvious bias while the other one doesn't. This one is written by a member of the Black consciousness movement. The other one is written by the government official. So those are the differences between the source. And those differences help you understand the different points of view and help you to interpret the source. And then in terms of concepts that you need to remember when you're doing this topic of Black consciousness is the starting point is apartheid. You need to know what apartheid was and what it entailed. Obviously not in detail. We're not expecting you to know the different apartheid laws that were passed by the government, but just to be able to define the concept of apartheid, that it was about the division of black and white people in every sphere of life. As simply as that. You don't need to know everything about it. Okay, so that you can understand where Black consciousness comes in. Also, the theme is called civil society protests. Now, you need to know what constitutes civil society. What is civil society? Civil society means people, ordinary people who are not members of the government or the police and big businesses. That is civil society, because that is what the theme is looking at. They're looking at the role of civil society in opposing apartheid. And then because we're looking at Black consciousness, you should be able to define the philosophy of Black consciousness. What was Black consciousness about? How was it different from the forms of struggle that had been used previously? And then the last thing is self-reliance, which was part of Black consciousness. And then an easy way to learn this section is you need to know the context or the background. So in other words, you need to understand why Black consciousness came into being. What happened before? And then you need to know the aims of Black consciousness. What was Black consciousness about? What did they want to achieve? And then the next thing you need to look at are the actions or tactics. That means how did the Black consciousness movement go about achieving their aims? So you'll be looking at them setting up the Black People's Convention, the self-help schemes, and all those things. And then the next thing that you have to look at is the significance of Black consciousness, because that is the whole point of looking at Black consciousness. What role did it play in South African politics in terms of opposing the apartheid government? So that is where you'll be looking at the successes and failures. So what exactly did the Black consciousness achieve and what did it fail to achieve? And then finally, you'll be looking at how the Black consciousness influenced the Soweto Uprising. And please note that I say influenced and not caused, because the Black consciousness movement did not cause the Soweto Uprising, but it influenced it. So those are all the skills and concepts you need to know and be familiar with before you can tackle the exam. So once you know all those things, then you must know that you are well prepared for the exam. So what I'd like us to do now is to look at the source and look at the questions so that we can see how you apply those skills. So this is source A. I'm not going to read the entire source because it's a very, very long source, but I've already told you that this source focuses on the influence that the philosophy of Black consciousness had on the Soweto Uprising. So what you need to do is you look at the source and you underline important points like self-confidence. So already that tells you what Black consciousness was about. Okay, and that was a very important development in South African history. And you look at things like soul searching, that these young people were left without leaders because the leaders were in exile, so they had to find a way to express themselves. And then another thing that will help you understand Black consciousness, because remember we're looking at the context, the background, the aims, the tactics or action, and then the significance. It broke away from a multiracial but white-dominated National Union of South African Students, or NUSAS. So that already tells you that there was an organization before Black consciousness, and it was made up of both Black and white people. But what was the problem with that organization? It was dominated by white people. So that is the reason why then Black people decided to break away and form their own organization known as the South African Students Organization. So that information will give you background about, background of the Black consciousness movement. And then in terms of significance, so you look at this source, it says after that there were other organizations that were standing for Black consciousness that were formed. So Black consciousness was very important in bringing about other organizations like the South African Student Movement, the BPC, and so on. Now let's look at the questions, because as I said to you before, we are not going to read the entire source. I'm just showing you how to analyze the source. So when you're reading the source, you need to circle, you need to underline or highlight those things that help you understand the philosophy of Black consciousness. So in terms of the questions, okay, so if we look at question 1, the question is, according to the source, what was the fastest growing philosophy among the Black South African youth? That is for 1 mark. And that is already in the source that we highlighted before. So you go back to your source and you already know that it was the Black consciousness philosophy. So you go back to your question, you look at it. This is a comprehension question. They just want to check to see that you've understood the source. So if you look at the answer there, it's Black consciousness. That is already in the source. And then we go on to the next question. Explain the term Black consciousness in your own words. Now, remember earlier on I told you the importance of understanding the concepts in this section. So you have to do it in your own words. So it can be from memory, from doing Black consciousness in class, because obviously in the teaching this will have been done. So you can say something like, Black people should be proud of themselves. Black people should do things on their own without the help of white people. That is the self-reliance I told you about. It was aimed to conscientize mainly Black South Africans about their political, economic, and cultural rights. So again, that is your own knowledge. It's not comprehension, it's not extraction, but it's application. You're applying your own knowledge to this concept of Black consciousness. Okay, in some cases, this can be called recall, because you should know, before you attempt the exam, you should know what Black consciousness was about. And then we move on to the next question. What factors do you think motivated Black South African students to break away from NUSAS? What factors? So you look at that, and those are the things you should be looking for. What factors do you think motivated Black students to break away from the National Union of South African Students? So you need to go back to your source and find those factors. So remember, when we looked at the source, I told you that the National Union of South African Students, even though it was a multiracial organization, it was dominated by white people. So you've got that, white dominated. That will be one of the possible answers you can give. There. So these are the possible answers. That it did not fight for the rights of black South Africans. It was dominated by white people. Black students were not satisfied with the separate accommodation facilities for white and black students. Surely this information is at the bottom of the source, because remember, we didn't read the entire source because we have to look at other questions. White South Africans were not able to fight for the cause of black people, because that is what black consciousness was about, that black people had to be independent. They had to fight on their own without the help of white people. And then we move on to the next question. Again, remember, we are looking at those skills of comprehension, extraction, analysis, interpretation, application, and so on. So question 1.4, name 2 organizations that were formed to instill the philosophy of black consciousness in black students. Again, that is in the source. We did look at that because I said to you that was the significance of black consciousness. So you look at organizations like the South African Students' Movement, the Black People's Convention. Those are just some of the examples of the organizations that were formed as a result of black consciousness. There. Okay, the South African Students' Movement, you have your Black People's Convention, and then SASO that broke away from the National Union of South African Students that was dominated by white people. So again, you're extracting information from the source, and that goes hand in hand with comprehension, because you will not be able to extract information if you have not understood the source. Then the next question, question 1.5, explain how the philosophy of black consciousness influenced African and colored school children in the Cape in 1976. Now you look at the mark allocation there, because that should guide the answer you're going to give. 2 times 2 equals 4. That means they're expecting you to give 2 points, not just 1 point. So in your explanation, you are going to, these are just possible answers. So you'll be looking at things like they became aware about the philosophy of black consciousness. So that is the reason why they then decided to fight the system, because they were proud of being black. They stood up for their rights and demanded equal education. Again, that is what black consciousness was about, teaching black people to be proud of being black. It conscientized them to target inferior education. So again, if you look at the hierarchy of causes of black consciousness, you will know that Bantu education was one of the reasons why the children of 1976 decided to take to the streets. It's because they were not satisfied. They were not happy with the inferior education they were given. Defined the imposition of Bantu education by boycotting exams on the Swart program, and it influenced them to be self-reliant. So if you look at all those things, all those points, they are about the philosophy of black consciousness. So those questions are about comprehension and extracting information from the source. And remember what I said before, you will not be able to extract information from the source if you have not understood it. Okay, and also it's very important that you learn your work, you study, so that when you read the source, you already have background information. Don't think that the source on its own will give you all the information you need. It's very important to have background knowledge from your lessons, from studying, and then when you read the source, you know what the source is about. You're able to contextualize it. And then we look at the next questions. So we've looked at question 1 up to 4, and I said to you, sorry, up to 5, and I said to you, all those were comprehension and extraction of information questions. Now let's look at question 2. Question 2 says the instruction is study source 2. Now I'd like you to look at a different kind of source, because history is about using different types of sources. So now we're going to look at a visual source. So we're going to go back to our source booklet. So this is still part of that textual or written source that we've already dealt with, and you used that for question 1 for those lower order thinking skills. So if we go to the next source, source 2, again, before you even look at the source, as you can see, this is a visual source, but before you even look at it, it's very important to study the caption. Now the caption is this information at the top of the source, because the information at the bottom of the source, this information, you are not going to use to answer the questions in the exam. This information is just there to say the examiner has not plagiarized. They got the source from this other source. So the only information you need is this information at the top of the source here. So this is where you're going to find the origin of the source and the description of the source. So let's read this one together. This cartoon by A.B. Berry, which appeared in the Star newspaper. So that is another clue that this did not appear in a black newspaper, but it appeared in a white newspaper, the Star newspaper. So what is the source about? So you carry on reading. The source depicts the reasons for the Soweto Uprising. So before you even look at the source, you already know that this source is about the reasons for the Soweto Uprising. Okay, so let me circle the reasons so that you can see. So that when you go and analyze the source, in other words, you look at the different clues, okay, to see the reasons, you already know what the source is about. Now let's look at the source and see what clues we can get from the source to show us or tell us what the source is about. Now remember, the caption has already told us that this is a cartoon. A cartoon is different from a photograph because in a cartoon, everything is there for a reason. It is not like a photograph where the photographer captures the moment. So for example, if there's a person standing here right in front of me and there are things behind that person and I want to capture that person, the things behind him are going to appear as well, even though I don't want them in the photograph. But with a cartoon, it's very different. The cartoonist, that is the person drawing the cartoon, decides what they want to include in the cartoon. So they can't just include things there by accident. So when you're analyzing cartoons, that is what you need to bear in mind. That it really doesn't matter how insignificant an element or an item in the cartoon can be, it is very significant. There is a reason why the cartoonist has included it there. And the reason is to convey a particular message. Okay, so if you look at this source, you can see already there is Soweto here. And what is happening? Soweto is in flames. There are flames there. And then there's another very important thing. If the word Soweto was not there, there's another clue that you can use to help you. You can see the houses, all the houses there, the structure. Now you already know the apartheid system and how black people got inferior education, inferior houses, and inferior everything. So if you look at those houses, you already know that this cannot be a white area. So this was Soweto, and the caption has already told you that this is looking at the reasons for the Soweto Uprising. And then another very important thing that is in this source is that there is a word that is written in Afrikaans, and that is the word school. Okay, now you might not understand the meaning of that word, because you don't know Afrikaans, because this is history and not Afrikaans. But what should catch your attention is the fact that this word has been crossed out. So you need to ask yourself, why? Why has the cartoonist crossed out the word school? Now let's go to the questions and see what type of questions you will get for a visual source. So we've studied source 2, we've looked at it, we've analyzed it, we've looked for visual clues to the event, we read the caption, we know that it was about the reasons for the Soweto Uprising, and then we looked for the different clues to help us understand those reasons. Question 2.1. The Afrikaans word school, now there's the explanation for you if you cannot speak Afrikaans. It says it's a school. So that word is crossed out in the cartoon. Now using this information, that is the information that the word is crossed out, so already they're helping you understand the clues in the cartoon as well. And you use your own knowledge as well. Remember what I said to you before, that you are not walking into the exam without any prior knowledge. It's very important to revise your work before you tackle the exam. Now you need to explain the messages that the cartoonist intended to convey. Now remember, I've already told you that the reason why a cartoonist draws a cartoon is to convey a particular message. They either want to support, praise the event, or they want to criticize it. Okay, and then when you say the cartoonist is supporting the event, then you need to say why, using the visual clues. So if we look at the answer there, look at the possible answers. There is a torch in the source that represents the success of Afrikaner culture in terms of language. And the students in Soweto rejected being taught in Afrikaans. Now, how do you know that the students rejected being taught in Afrikaans? It's because they crossed out that Afrikaans word school. So that's the next point, that the crossing out of the word school symbolizes the rejection of formal schooling, because that was Bantu education. And then we go back to the questions. Sorry, that's the source. How does the cartoonist, this is question 2.2, how does the cartoonist Barry use the visual element of the flame or the torch to convey his message? Okay, how does the cartoonist, so you already know what the message is because that was the previous question. Now, how does he do it? How does the cartoonist use the visual element of the flame to convey his message? How does he help us to understand the message? So let's go back to the source again. And this is what we're talking about. How does he do it? And then the possible answers there are that the flame or the torch symbolizes the celebration of Afrikaans in 1975, because you will remember from your learning that that is the year when the government enforced the Afrikaans language policy, where black students had to learn half of their subjects in Afrikaans. Okay. The flame can also symbolize the uprising. Remember earlier on I said to you, you can see the houses, you can see Soweto, and it's in flame. So that symbolizes the uprising that occurred in Soweto against the issue of Afrikaans. So it shows you that the students were against Afrikaans. They were fighting against it. It also symbolizes the burning of the schools and the buildings, the government buildings, cars, and everything else. So that is the flame. That is what it was about, because again, you know from your own knowledge from the lessons that students decided to burn government buildings, schools, and everything when they were rejecting their language. Even though the uprising started peacefully, the students decided to do that when it turned violent because of the way the police reacted. So if you look at all those possible answers from that source, you can see that the torch is the symbol, and it's the idea that runs through all of them. So we've looked at both the written and a visual source and how we analyze those in history. And we've looked at the skills of comprehension, extraction, and analysis. So now we're going to go to an ad break, and I'm going to give you time to think about this. And when we come back, we are going to be looking at more skills like how we compare sources and how we detect bias and so on. Welcome back. Now you remember in the previous session, we looked at a visual source and a textual source. And we also looked at the skills of comprehending the source, extracting information from the source, and analyzing, and we analyzed both the written and the visual source. Now, the next question I'd like us to look at is a source where we're comparing. Now, remember earlier on I did say to you, another thing that you'll be expected to do in the exam is to compare and contrast. Now, comparing means looking for similarities, while contrasting means looking for differences. Now, if you look at question 3, say study sources 1 and 2. We've already looked at those sources. If we can go back to them, source 1 was that extract focusing on the influence that the philosophy of black consciousness had on the Soweto Uprising of 1976. And then source 2 was that cartoon that we analyzed together by Abe Berry, which appeared in the Star, and that also it shows the reasons for the Soweto Uprising of June 16. So now, in terms of the question, so you've studied both sources, you've dealt with the questions in terms of comprehension, extraction, and analysis. Now you need to comment on how these sources support each other regarding the Soweto Uprising. Now that word, support each other, already tells you that these sources are in agreement, even though they're written by different people. They are both about the same thing. They support each other regarding the Soweto Uprising. And then in terms of the answer, because remember we're comparing these two sources. They support each other, so we're looking at the things that are similar between the two sources. So source 1 refers to the burning of the books, and source 2 shows the smoke or the flame. So those are the two things that are similar. That is how they support each other. So the one is saying it in terms of written form, while the other one is showing it visually. That is the support. They are both about the same thing. Source 1 refers to the boycotting of the Afrikaans exam, and source 2 symbolizes the rejection of Afrikaans as a language. So that's another similarity between the two, that it shows, both sources show the rejection of the language Afrikaans. Now you'll remember that if we go back to the source, I did say to you that the word school written in Afrikaans has been crossed out, and that symbolizes the rejection. Okay, and then if you go back to the written source, it tells you that the students rejected Afrikaans. So those are the points of similarity between the two sources. And then source 1 and 2 highlight the need to resist Afrikaans as a language of instruction and the rejection of Bantu education. So they're both about the same thing, that the black students were not happy with the inferior education the government was giving them, and they decided to fight against it. So as you can see again, you look at the mark allocation, 2 times 2 equals 4, you're only expected to give 2 points that show similarity. Now this is a marking memo. Obviously it's going to give you a lot of possible answers, because somebody might give the first point and the third point, another person might give the second and the third point. It really doesn't matter, as long as you understand how the two sources support each other. And then we move on to question 4. Now, this one requires you to use all the sources. So you've studied all the sources under this theme. You need to study all of them. So it's very important to read the instruction. It says, using information from all the sources and your own knowledge. So please make sure that when you write this paragraph, okay, you are not writing an essay, you are not writing in point form, you are writing a paragraph. Please make sure that you've got enough information from all the sources and information from your own knowledge as well. It can't just be information from the sources. It might happen that the information from the sources is similar to your own information, but try and find information that is not in the sources from your own information to show that you have used both. Because as I said to you, there is no way you can get the full 8 marks if you've only extracted information from the source. So this is where the skill of application comes in, where you are using your information to understand the source. So you can see how the source explains the event that you've already done in class. Please make sure you do that. And also you need to stick to the word limit. Don't count the words, but they say, the instruction does tell you that about 8 lines. So if you write maybe 10 lines, more than 8, it's really not a train smash. It's fine as long as it is short. It has to be concise. It can't be a page long, because then you've written too much, and you'll find that when you've written a page, then you've repeated yourself. What we're looking for here is specific information. And what you're doing here, you're explaining the various measures that the apartheid government put in place to limit the influence of the Black consciousness movement. So again, you will know that from the source and your own knowledge. And I did tell you before that it's very important to know the significance of the movement, where you look at the successes and the failures of the Black consciousness movement. So that is what you'll be expected to do there. I will not look at all the answers there, but you can see that most of the information comes from the sources. I'm not going to read them with you again, but they come from the sources and they come from own knowledge. For example, the fact that Steve Biko and other activists were arrested, tortured, and killed. You already know that because you've already done Black consciousness in class. Okay, so moving on to the next question, which is now the extended writing. Now, what happens in this part of the exam is that there is a choice. You have to answer one of the following questions. Now, you have to choose carefully. Now, you read the instruction. It tells you that you answer one of the following questions. So you can either do 5.1 or 5.2. Now, the question is, what should guide your choice? Obviously, you're going to have to read both questions to see which one you're comfortable with. So if we look at 5.1, again, I'm not going to read the answers with you. Okay, this is just to help you with making a choice of questions. Explain how the philosophy of Black consciousness influenced the Soweto Uprising of 1976. Now, when you go back to the sources, you will see that the source that answers that question is mainly source 1. The other sources are about the actual uprising and not how Black consciousness influenced it. So, which means in this question, this extended writing question, the points that you are going to give to answer are mainly from your own knowledge. So you have to rely on your memory to do this. You all know how to write an essay, the structure. You can't write in point form. It has to flow and all that. So you look at the main points, explain how, that is the key word, how the philosophy of Black consciousness influenced the Soweto Uprising. So you're comparing the two. Make sure that you don't end up just writing about Black consciousness alone, or just writing about the Soweto Uprising alone. You need to marry the two. So you're looking at Black consciousness and what it stood for, and how then that influenced the students to fight against the language policy. Again, another mistake that a lot of people make is to start writing about the actual Soweto Uprising, like how it took place and how many people died and all that. That is not what the question is asking you. The question is asking you how the philosophy of Black consciousness influenced the movement. So you're looking at cause and effect. This was the philosophy of Black consciousness, and this is how the Black students responded to it. This is what they learned from it, and then they decided to fight the language policy. It's not asking you how they fought the language policy, like the other sources show you. So it's very important to analyze the question properly before you answer it. Because as you can see, if you know the Soweto Uprising very well, and you know how it happened, it's very easy for you to think that is what you have to do here. That is not what you have to do. Don't tell us about the uprising and how it happened, who organized it and all that. No, the focus is Black consciousness leading to the Soweto Uprising. Okay, and then as I said, we are not going to look at the answers together because it's an essay. It's very, very long, and you'll know that this exam papers are available on the Department of Education website. Now, the second choice, question 5.2, remember you can't do both. You do either 5.1 or 5.2. So if you're comfortable with your own knowledge and you understand exactly what you need to do as I've explained it, then you will choose 5.1 and then connect Black consciousness to the Soweto Uprising. And then 5.2 says, John Kane Berman stated that a new generation has grown up, and these younger men and women are impatient, radical, militant, brave, and proud. Do you agree with this statement? Now, it's very, very important to note that there is a statement or a quotation here. So in your answer, you need to refer to it. Okay, so it starts there where he is talking about a new generation of young people who are impatient. In other words, they're not going to follow the passive resistance of the ANC and the PAC. They're younger as well. They're not the older generation of the Nelson Mandelas and the Walter Sisulus and so on. They're men and women. They're militant. In other words, they're ready to fight. They're brave and proud. This is the word that should guide you. So again, while this question is slightly different from 5.1, you can see the connection because Black consciousness was about Black pride. So in describing this group of young people who took up arms in 1976, Black consciousness does come in. And the question is, do you agree with this statement? Okay, this is just asking you, guiding you how to answer the question. Nowhere in the essay do you have to say, I agree or I disagree. You don't use personal pronouns. I hope you all know that. Your answer will show the marker that whether you agree or not. Okay, obviously you're going to have to agree because you've done Black consciousness and you saw how it influenced the Soweto Uprising and how these young people were militant and radical. So unlike 5.1, this question is looking at the Soweto Uprising because you have to prove the following. I've already looked at the pride. You have to prove that. So that is where you're looking at the influence of black consciousness. But you also need to prove the impatience, okay? The fact that they were radical and the militancy. So in this question, this is where you actually deal with the Soweto Uprising. Unlike in the first one, where you are not looking at the actual uprising, but you are looking at how it was influenced by black consciousness. It's very, very important to understand the question before you tackle them. Okay, and then the nice thing about this question is that you are using the information from all the sources and then your own knowledge. So the information is already there as a springboard to help you answer the question. But as I said to you before, this one is slightly different from the previous one, because the previous one is only looking at the philosophy of black consciousness, but this one is looking at both the philosophy of black consciousness, hence the word proud and militant and impatient and all that, but it's also looking at the actual uprising. Okay, again, we are not going to look at the answer to the essay. You know about the main ideas that you have to look at, the background. As I told you, that is very important to understand the context, understand the aims and tactics, actions, and then the results or significance. That is how you elaborate and all that. So as you can see, again, this is about the Soweto Uprising, and then black consciousness comes into it, whereas the other one is only about the black consciousness. And if I can just underline this without looking at everything, you can see that it's about the Soweto Uprising, because it's dealing with the details of the uprising and not just the philosophy of black consciousness. Another thing that shows you that this essay is not just about the philosophy of the black consciousness, but it's about the Soweto Uprising, is the fact that there was violence, and it also tells you that the first victim to die was Hector Peterson. And also remember, I told you that looking at significance is another important thing. And this tells you that the event, that is the Soweto Uprising, was very important because it was a turning point in the history of South Africa. And you might have to flesh that out and say why. In other words, what were the results of the Soweto Uprising? And then the last thing is you do a conclusion, bearing in mind the quotation, and that is where you show whether you agree with it or not. And that should happen throughout, but that's where you restate your main points. Don't bring in any new ideas, and that is how you end up your essay. So that's it for today. Remember that the question papers and the memos are on our website. If you need to get detailed information, they're there. But also remember what I said, that it's very important to have your own information as well. So you read those textbooks, you read the notes and everything. So that's it for today. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time when we look at the impact of the Cold War on Africa.